Welcome again to Where the Monsters Are. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Lou.
And if you love true crime, supernatural stories and horror, then you're in the right place. Okay, so who has watched The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix? In this episode, we're going to talk about the author and the book that inspired the series. So if you want to know more, stay tuned. But just before we start, can I get you to give us a like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on? And we'd really appreciate a review too. We have a new story available every Sunday at 8 p.m, and you can follow us on social media for more. Okay, so let's get on with tonight's story. As I said before, if you've watched Netflix Haunting of Hill House, you'll be familiar with this story. I really like the show. I've actually watched it a few times now, and the story told on that show is based on a novel by Shirley Jackson. I have to say I actually haven't read the book yet, but that is something I want to do, if nothing else, just to see the differences between it and the TV show. But I know you've read it, haven't you, Lou?
I have, yeah, and it is one of my favourite horror books. It is a really good book.
Yeah. Right then, I really did like the show, but that does get you to thinking, was it based on real events? Did Shirley Jackson base her novel on a true story? Well, the answer to that is yes, in a way. So the book, The Haunting of Hill House, written as I mentioned before by author Shirley Jackson, was published in 1959, but it wasn't based on one particular ghost story that happened to spark her attention. It was based on a collection of ghost stories and haunted houses that she'd come across, and based on pictures she collected over time of haunted castles and houses. The Winchester House in California and the Castle Neuschwanstein in Germany is amongst them. But it was also inspired by one of her favourite books, an adventure, written in 1911 and published under the pseudonyms of Elizabeth Morrison and Frances Lamont. Okay, well first I'm going to talk a little bit more about the author that wrote the book. So Shirley Hardy Jackson was born on the 14th of December 1916. She's an American author who is mostly known for her stories of mysteries and horrors. Her writing career spanned over 20 years, in which time she composed 6 full novels, 2 memoirs, and over 200 short stories. She was born in San Francisco to parents Leslie and Geraldine Jackson, and the family's wealth was made from building houses for the millionaires in California. She was raised in Burlingame, which is in the suburbs of San Francisco, in a 2-story brick house on Forest View Road. Her parents married young, and Geraldine pretty soon became pregnant with Shirley, which she was disappointed about, as it took her away from spending time with her handsome new husband. And for that reason, Shirley always had a somewhat strained relationship with her mother, who always seemed to favour her younger brother. Shirley grew up as a bit of a loner. She found it hard to fit in with other children and spent most of her time alone writing, much to her mother's disdain, who wanted her to follow a more conventional way of life. Her weight began to fluctuate through her teenage years, which affected her confidence and was something she would continue to struggle with throughout her life. But Shirley did have a relationship with her grandmother, who she was close to and nicknamed Mimi. Shirley's grandmother was a Christian Science practitioner who would, as she claimed, spiritually heal people. This was something that Shirley was always sceptical about. She, in fact, recalled the time when Mimi had claimed to have broken her own leg and had spent the whole night praying and had healed herself, but it then turned out to have just been a sprained ankle. When her grandmother died, Shirley informed her daughter that she had died of Christian Science. She believed that religion could be a vehicle for harm, and the influences of religion from throughout her childhood were very clear in Shirley's writing, which often included themes of witchcraft and mysticism and the powers of the mind. Her teenage years were spent attending Burlingame High School. She took up playing the violin during this time and played in the school orchestra. And in her senior year the family moved to Rochester, New York, where she went to Brighton High School and got her diploma in 1934. After that she attended Rochester University, but she was unhappy there, and much to her parents' disapproval decided to take a year-long break from her studies before transferring to Syracuse University. Being away from the scrutiny of her family, she began to flourish creatively and socially, gaining a bachelor's degree in journalism. At this time she became involved in the campus literary magazine, and through this she met Stanley Edgar Hyman, who would become her future husband. It is said that after reading some of her work he declared that he was going to marry her. It was also while working on the magazine that she would have her first piece of work published, a short story titled Janice, which was about a teenager's suicide attempt. After graduating in 1940, the couple married and for a while spent time living in a few different places, including New York, where they both wrote for the New Yorker for a time, before they finally settled in North Bennington in Vermont, where Stanley took a job at the local college and Shirley continued to write. Their marriage was plagued by Hyman's constant affairs, often with students, and he didn't believe in monogamy, and it was said that in the end she agreed to his proposition of having a more open relationship. They did have 4 children, Lawrence, Joanne, Sarah and Barry, who all achieved their own fame in the literary world and were all included as fictional characters in their mother's short stories. Okay, so let's look into her writing career a little more. In 1948 she had a debut novel published. It was called The Road Through the Wall. It's a semi-autobiographical book about her childhood growing up in California in the 1920s. But it was her short story, The Lottery, which was published in 1948 in the New Yorker magazine, that gained her public recognition and established her reputation as a horror writer. The tale was said to have outraged people with its dark portrayal of human nature, and the magazine received over 300 letters of complaint. It was later added to a short story collection called The Lottery and Other Stories. Her next novel, Hangsaman, in 1951, was said to be somewhat based on the real-life disappearance of an 18-year-old Bennington College student named Paula Jean Weldon. Although the case remains unsolved to this day, it was also supposed to have been inspiration for her short story, The Missing Girl, that was published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1957. Then the year after, she brought out her second semi-autobiographical novel, which was called Life Among the Savages, and was a collection of short stories based on herself and her 4 children. I love that title. Although becoming well known in her own right as an author, the confidence issues that had plagued her from a young age were still apparent, as she was very reluctant to discuss her work publicly. She was quoted as saying, "I very much dislike writing about myself or my work, and when pressed for autobiographical material, I can only give a bare chronological outline which contains naturally no pertinent facts. I was born in San Francisco in 1916 and spent most of my earlier life in California. I was married in 1940 to Stanley Edgar Hyman, a critic, and we live in Vermont in a quiet rural community with fine scenery and comfortably far away from city life. Our main exports are books and children, both of which we produce in abundance. The children are Lawrence, Joanne, Sarah and Barry, and my books include 3 novels, The Road Through the Wall, Hangsaman and The Bird's Nest, and a collection of short stories. The Lottery and Life Among the Savages is a disrespectful memoir to my children. In 1954, she published The Bird's Nest, the story of a woman with multiple personalities and her relationship with her psychiatrist, and was quoted by one of her publishers, Roger Strauss, as being the perfect novel. Then came her 5th novel in 1959, The Haunting of Hill House, which was about a group of people participating in a paranormal study in a haunted mansion. It went on to become a critically esteemed example of a haunted house story that Stephen King himself described as one of the most important horror novels of the 20th century, creating his own adaptation of her story into his 3-part miniseries Rose Red. The contents of Rose Red are loosely based on her Gothic novel, but they veer more toward the influence of the Winchester House, which I won't mention really here as it'll be a future podcast. But Stephen King, who is known for being one of the most well-known horror writers of the 20th and 21st centuries, has on more than one occasion expressed his admiration for Shirley Jackson, saying she's one of his primary sources of inspiration in his own writing. Including The Haunting of Hill House, which he first pitched the idea of back in 1966, but went back to revise his screenplay and add new additions to alter the original story. And although watching Rose Red, the similarities are probably few, I think it's cool to think that one of the greatest horror writers of our time wanted to pay respect to probably one of the pioneers of the whole genre. By the time The Haunting of Hill House was published, Shirley's health was starting to decline. She'd always been a heavy smoker and suffered from chronic asthma, dizziness and joint pain which attributed to a heart problem. She began to suffer with severe anxiety and agoraphobia, which kept her housebound for long periods of time. The anxiety was thought to have been caused by prolonged use over the years of amphetamines, which she took for weight loss. She also saw a psychiatrist for this. He prescribed barbiturates, which at the time were considered safe, but this led to a cycle of prescription drug abuse as she took tablet after tablet to counteract the effects caused by the others. Despite her ill health, she never stopped writing and published several more things in the 1960s, and then in 1965 she died in her sleep at home in Bennington at the age of 48. Her death was due to a coronary occlusion due to arteriosclerosis or cardiac arrest, and she was cremated as her wish. Right, so now you know who the author of the book was, let's look a little bit more in depth at how it came to be. Okay, so as I said before, she based the idea of the story on her own favourite novel, which was called An Adventure. It was the telling of the supposed true accounts of two British girls named Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, and an encounter they had whilst in Paris while they were at the Palace of Versailles. Now, what they told was a story of a strange unexplained experience that they put down to the supernatural and time travel. Now, at the time of the book's release, it caused widespread interest and excitement, but it was also ridiculed. According to the two women's story, whilst visiting the palace, they weren't overly impressed by what they saw, so decided to head off and search for the Petit Trianon, which was a chateau that was supposed to have been built in the palace grounds by King Louis XV. And while searching for it, they got lost and either missed or took a wrong turn. So they ended up walking down a narrow lane instead of the main avenue. And whilst walking, they saw a deserted farmhouse with an old plough outside. They also saw a woman shaking a white cloth out of the window, and suddenly a feeling of oppression came over them. They then saw men dressed like gardeners in long coats. They were also wearing three-cornered hats. They came to a cottage where a woman and a girl, who was maybe her daughter, were stood in the doorway. The woman was holding a jug. Jourdain recalled it was like a tableau vivant, which means a living picture, or like a waxwork model, but Moberly did not see the actual cottage, although she did feel the atmosphere change, stating that everything suddenly looked unnatural and unpleasant, and even the trees seemed flat and lifeless like a tapestry. There were no effects from light or shade, and no wind stirred the trees. They continued on their journey, hoping to find Petit Trianon, and came to the edge of a wood near Temple de la Mort. This part may sound familiar if you've read Shirley Jackson's book, as Hill House is found in a wood, and there was a man seated outside wearing a clock and a large hat. Moberly recounted that he turned to look in their direction with the most repulsive look. His complexion was dark and rough, and he had small pock scars and an evil yet unseeing expression. And although they did not feel he was particularly looking at them, they still felt a repugnance as they walked past him. Jourdain said another tall man with large dark eyes and curling black hair that sat under a large sombrero hat then showed up and took them to Petit Trianon. The women later thought this could have been Comte de Vaudreuil, who was an acquaintance of the 18th century royalty. After this, they finally crossed a bridge that came to the gardens in front of the palace, where Moberly saw a lady sketching on the grass. She looked right at them. Now, Jourdain did not see this woman, despite Moberly insisting she could see her sitting right in front of them, and even pointed out she was wearing a summer dress and a white hat, and she was fair-haired. At first she wondered if she too was a tourist like them, although her clothing seemed old-fashioned in comparison to what they wore, and she looked a few centuries older in her dress style. She actually felt that this woman may have been Marie Antoinette, the queen who was killed during the French Revolution, and with that they were at the entrance to the palace, where they joined up again with the other visitors. It was a week later before the pair spoke of it, and Moberly wrote to tell her sister. They were both convinced the Petit Trianon was haunted, but it took them another 3 months to compare notes and write it all up. They went on to research the area and even returned a few times, but could never again find the route they'd taken, and the bridge was missing. They were sure then that they had witnessed a haunting and had somehow travelled back through time. They looked up the man they had thought to be the Comte de Vaudreuil and found he'd been a friend of Marie Antoinette. They put all of their findings together in the book and they called it an adventure. A lot of the readers had their own theories about what the pair had experienced. Some said that they'd just misinterpreted what was essentially just normal events. Some even suggested that they were at a fancy dress party. But in 1903, an old map of the Trianon Gardens was found, and on that map it showed a bridge that was not on any other maps, and it was in the exact place that the women had said they'd seen it and crossed over it. Psychologist Leonard Zusny claimed it was just an hallucination that got more and more out of control over time the more information they found out about the area. But whatever did happen that day to the women, the case, known as Mobley Jourdain's incident of the ghosts of Petit Trian, is still unexplained. So back to the haunting of Hill House. It tells the tale of a paranormal activity investigator who recruits a group of volunteers at random to stay with him at Hill House. Why does he do this, you might wonder? Well, because there have been some scary goings on and he wants to get to the bottom of them. So the story continues with the inquisitive guests being tormented by the spirits that live in the mansion. But did any of this happen in real life? According to Ruth Franklin, who wrote a biography on Shirley Jackson, she claims the setting for the novel was inspired by the story of Sarah Winchester. Now, as I said before, I have another episode coming up soon on the Winchester house, so I don't want to go over it too much here. But basically, Sarah Winchester had a fortune made from firearms that she used to turn what was a San Jose farmhouse into what became known as the Winchester Mystery House. She was said to be tormented by the guilt of how her family had made their fortune and was haunted by the ghosts of the people their firearms had been used to kill. She'd inherited over $20 million after her husband died and moved to California, where she built a house for the ghosts of the dead they had profited from. She spent nearly 40 years until she died in 1922 adding to the house. The house was famous all over the country and it gave Shirley Jackson the setting for what would eventually become a story, but without the hauntings at the Winchester, as the Winchesters were pretty tame compared to what Shirley wanted to put in her tale. So her inspiration then moved across the country to the streets of Harlem, to be exact. Shirley Jackson in 1957 had visited an apartment in Harlem that had been the scene of an horrific fire in which 3 people had died. Now there's speculation whether this actually was true or not, as Shirley claimed 9 people had died there, but the official record was actually 3. She also got the location wrong, but she did say it was the closest she'd ever come herself to a supernatural experience, and it was the motivation she needed to make her want to write the kind of novel you can't read alone in a dark house at night. She was quoted as saying that most people have never seen a ghost and most people would never want to, but almost everyone can admit that at some time they've had a feeling they couldn't explain if they weren't careful, if they turned a corner too suddenly, or if they opened their eyes too soon and woke up in the night, or if they went into a dark room without hesitating first. Although the haunting of Hill House isn't based on anything she experienced herself, it was inspired by her interest in the occult. She had a huge library of books on witchcraft and was greatly inspired by the stories of other people, but she never had any brushes with the supernatural herself. Instead, she was inspired by the stories of others, one of which was the psychical researcher Nandor Fodor, whose collection of poltergeist accounts inspired her. And if that wasn't enough to send shivers up your spine, here's another fact connected to Shirley Jackson's novel. The location of the 1963 movie adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House was filmed at Ettington Park Hotel in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. This hotel, which was built in the 1850s, is also reportedly haunted, and to this day the staff that work there continue to report objects moving and strange noises that have no explanation. Another explanation as to the source of some of her inspiration for the book is that it could have also been based on her own struggles with loneliness, and that the character of Eleanor, or in the Netflix series now, may have actually been based on her own issues. In a letter she wrote to her estranged husband at the time she was writing The Haunting of Hill House, she said, "You once wrote me a letter telling me that I would never be lonely again. I think that was the most dreadful lie you ever told me." It's now over 60 years since the novel debuted. It has had 2 film adaptations in 1963 and 1999 and has inspired many authors over the years in the same way she was inspired before that. Most recently, it gained a new following of fans through the Netflix series based on it, and Shirley Jackson's work lives on, as does she, through its words. Maybe there's a little bit of an adventure in its pages, maybe the mystery of the Winchester house or the supernatural encounter in Harlem, and maybe her inspiration was just her own loneliness.
That was very interesting.
She does sound quite sad, really, because she died at quite a young age.
Yeah, you said 48.
48 she was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know she died so young at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I've only ever read the one book by her. I've not read any of her others, but it's kind of made me want to read some of her other stuff as well.
Yeah, she sounded an interesting lady. Kind of tragic, but then, you know, she had 4 children who she seemed to be really close to, so her husband wasn't so great.
No, I think that's a shame that she had a relatively unhappy childhood and an unhappy marriage.
Yeah.
I guess the only good thing about her childhood was probably her grandmother.
Yeah.
That's probably about the only thing that sort of got her through, I'm guessing. And she obviously had emotional issues, what with all the barbiturates.
Well, yeah, she obviously struggled with her weight and her confidence.
Yeah, confidence, that was the word I was thinking of. It's surprising to me. And what did surprise me was that Stephen King was inspired so much by her.
As you know, I'm a really big fan of his, and
yeah,
he's mentioned a few times, you know, about his admiration for Shirley Jackson.
Rose Red thing was interesting. I mean, I've watched Rose Red and I do really like that mini-series, but I hadn't sort of considered that it is very similar in, you know, with the fact that there's the group of mediums.
Right, okay.
It is very similar to The Haunting. I mean, The Haunting is probably one of my favourite movies, the 1963 version. That's probably one of my favourite horror movies.
Yeah, I suppose in a way it's probably, well, it's a mixture of both, because to me you do think more Winchester House, the fact that, you know, the house kept growing. But yeah, definitely the bit where you've got the group of people that go in, the paranormal investigator.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really considered that. Or when I watched Rose Red, you totally straight away get the Winchester house. You totally get that. But I hadn't considered the other part of it with a group of mediums that's very similar to The Haunting. That's very good. I mean, to be fair, I had a few thoughts throughout it, but you've pretty much covered it. I feel like I want to read The Adventure.
Okay.
Yeah, I do feel like I want to read that and see what it was like.
The Adventure. I'm not sure what context, because if it's an old book, how it would be actually written, you know. But yeah, I mean, it might be worth looking for it. It sounds bizarre though. When I was, you know, researching it, I was like, yeah, it sounds like some weird trip, like they were on drugs or something.
A bit of opium or something. Because when did you say that was written?
Oh, I'm sure it was in the early 90s, like maybe 1911 or something. It's an old book.
Oh, so it was really early.
Yeah, it was, I'm sure. I can remember exactly, but I think it was around about 1911. I'm sure it was, off the top of my head.
I'm guessing that's not going to be in print anymore. I might not be able to find that one.
Maybe not. Kindle.
Very interesting. It was.
Is it something a little bit different, because the TV show is so popular? I mean, everyone talks about the TV show, but you just think, who knows the story behind it, or
yeah,
you know, the person that wrote that story originally? Because a lot of people might just think it's a Netflix series.
Yeah, and not realise it's based on something.
Yeah, I just think it's nice sometimes to know a little bit more about where things come from.
Well, this is it. I mean, as I say, I mean, I love the book and I love the original sort of film that was made in the 60s, but I've never read anything else by her.
So if you've read the book then, how do you think it compares to the Netflix show? Because I'm guessing it's a lot different. Because for starters, that's based on a family, isn't it, in the show, whereas they were a group of paranormal investigators.
I think it's very different. The show is very good. I mean, I really enjoyed the first series of that, The Haunting of Hill House. I thought it was a really, really good programme. if you just take it on its own merits. But it's not similar to the book and the original film because, as you say, it's a family. In the original, it's a bunch of strangers investigating the paranormal. And what you find is even the characters are very different. The characters are the same. They've got the same names, like the brothers and the sisters are the same.
So the brothers and sisters have got the names of the strangers.
Yeah, so you've got Nell, you've got Theo, you've got the brother's name, I can't remember, but the one that plays the brother. You've got like the character of Hugh Crane, who in the remake, in the Netflix adaptation, he's the father of the children. But in the original, Hugh Crane is kind of like the unseen antagonist. He's the ghost, basically, in the house.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as I say, I love the film. I love the book, but I also love the adaptation, but not necessarily because it is the same as the book.
Yeah. It's weird because some people, if they're a real big fan of something like a book or an original movie and it's remade or it's retold and it's completely different,
yeah,
they don't always like it, do they?
They don't, but I think the thing that helped the Netflix adaptation was that it was just so good. The storytelling was good, the acting was good. I guess you just got to look at it as an adaptation. It's not the same as the original one.
I mean, for me, I just thought it was brilliant, but like I say, I've never read the book.
Yeah.
I have seen that film, but as we've discussed before, I just thought it was very slow for me.
I think it's all about like atmosphere, and you do get that in the book, but I don't know if that's because of the time it was written as well, because you haven't got like the very graphic horror that you probably have now. I mean, there are some horror books out now that are very graphic in what it's describing.
Yeah, totally.
But I think it's kind of about Nell's descent into madness, basically.
Yeah.
And she's a very lonely woman, and it's just the way that she is affected by what happens in the house. Now, obviously, in the Netflix adaptation, Nell kind of isn't there much. I won't go into too much detail if people haven't watched it, but you don't see much of her. Whereas in the original, she's the protagonist. Everything is seen from her point of view, but that's not really what happens in the Netflix show. I definitely enjoyed that.
Okay then. Well, I hope everyone thought that interesting and maybe learnt a little bit about the other side of the haunting.
I was really happy when you told me you were doing Shirley Jackson. So yeah, I've learnt something, definitely.
Good. Well, I'm very glad. Well, that's it then for another episode, Spooky Kids. So if you're enjoying these tales, then please subscribe to our channel on whatever platform you're listening on. We do have lots more stories of the supernatural, crime and horror to come, and we'd hate for you to miss any of them. And as always, a review is greatly appreciated. And if you fancy interacting with us anytime, then join us on our social media. Did you want to say anything about your next episode or...?
Yeah, I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it, but it's going to be discussing the tragic murder of an up-and-coming 80s actress. I won't really go into any more than that.
Okay, right then. Well, take care everyone, and we will be back next week.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.